The origin of the crazy cat lady is a story of economic liberation and the backlash against it. Hi, I'm Pugmalion, and we're going to try and find out the origin of the crazy cat lady trope. And also we're gonna be making this kitty cat, who is my cat. His name is Ravioli. Cats are one of the most common and beloved pets in the world, right after dogs and Madagascar hissing cockroaches. But what happens when someone takes their passion for their feline friends a little bit too far? Well, you end up with a crazy cat lady. A CCL, as I may or may not refer to these ladies in the future, is characterized by a few things other than her extreme love of cats. They are almost exclusively ladies, as their name implies. And usually, specifically, CCLs are older or postmenopausal women. And they are, by and large, single, either never married or widowed, and most often they're also childless. It's generally implied that her singleness / childlessness and love of cats are inexorably linked. Either that her cats are a coping mechanism for her failed relationships, or her cats are a sort of surrogate baby, or that whatever wackiness drives her to like cats so much also chases off suitors. Sometimes this wackiness is just her being career-oriented, and that she chased after her career so much for so long that her ovaries just ran out of eggs and all she has left are cats. And this career-orientedness will be a reoccurring theme as we examine these origins. On the extreme end of the CCL spectrum, you end up with characters like Eleanor Abernathy, or the crazy cat lady from The Simpsons. And on the more mild end of the spectrum, you end up with real-life personalities like the new age musician Enya, who has holed herself away in a castle with only a couple dozen cats for company and some serving staff because she's loaded. It should go without saying, and I'm not going to spend time harping on this point, but this is not a positive trope. What I'm interested in and what I'm going to talk about is when and how did cats specifically get associated with older, single, career-oriented women? Starting in the 19th century, we don't necessarily see an association between cats and women specifically, but we do see the beginnings of stereotyping of cat owners, especially in contrast to dog owners. In 1872, there was an editorial published in the New York Times called Cats and Craziness, and it contrasted a neurotic cat owner against a more even-keeled dog lover. So what's interesting about the late or mid 1800s is that this was kind of the first time there was such a thing as a dog person or a cat person, or really when owning pets was becoming accessible to the average person at all. If you don't know about the history of most dog breeds, it goes something like this. The aristocracy kept these dogs for hunting and companionship, and then in 18 blah blah blah, the Bichon Frise Kennel Club was founded by a British guy. Okay, actually it was 1933. Essentially, most dogs in general, and especially purebred dogs, were owned primarily by the aristocracy. And having a purebred dog was a huge status symbol. But with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the middle class, or the working class with disposable income, whatever you want to call them, pet ownership became a choice for people. People could go into cities and actually just buy dogs and cats now. By the mid-19th century, there were over 20,000 vendors just in London that sold live animals, both livestock and pets. So to have a cat in your house, you didn't have to just stumble on a litter of barn cats in your barn. You could just go and buy a cat. So it's probably fair to say that the distinction between a dog person and a cat person really started to take form in the mid-late 1800s, when people could actually choose to be a dog person or a cat person. But how did cats become linked specifically to women, and specifically to older women? To figure out why CCLs are specifically older women / career-oriented women, there's another archetype we have to examine, and that is the spinster. You could say that the crazy cat lady is sort of a subtype or an extreme version of the spinster. And so we're on the same page and thinking of the same definition. Spinsters are unmarried women who are considered to be past their prime marrying off years. So a single junior in college would not be a spinster, whereas a single 48-year-old woman, well, I'm not going to call her a spinster since that has some negative connotations nowadays, but you know. The term spinster didn't start off with negative connotations, no more than widow did. And just like widow was actually used on legal documents to define a woman as not being married, just how single is used on the census today. And the origin of this term gives us insight as to how the crazy cat lady stereotype stemmed from the spinster. Back in the day, before factories existed, yarn had to be spun by hand, and yarn would be spun at home, and we know that this task was primarily undertaken by women, specifically younger unmarried women, like teenage daughters or young adult women still living at home. So that's how the term spinster, one who spins yarn, came to refer to single women. But here's the interesting part, and this doesn't have to do with cats the way you think it does. This isn't because cats like yarn, and therefore people who spin yarn would inherently attract cats, though I'm not saying that's not part of it. This is the interesting part. Selling yarn was profitable enough that it could actually financially sustain a woman. Like, she wouldn't necessarily need to financially rely on a husband or even have a husband at all. So a number of ladies back even in the 14 or 1500s were able to financially sustain themselves all by themselves just by spinning yarn or making other products of what are generally called cottage industries, like cloth or candle or dresses or pickles. I don't really know. It was like they were running a pre-industrial Etsy shop pretty much. So there existed a group of older women who were just spinsters. They were single women living alone and financially sustaining themselves by spinning yarn or making pickle ricks, plushies or whatever. And this was one of the first ways that women emerged on the financial marketplace during the dawn of capitalism. We'll revisit these spinsters from the early modern era soon, but first let's fast forward until past the Industrial Revolution. This was when women in the West on a large scale began to see economic opportunities emerge as factories began hiring anyone. Of course, factory workers who were women or children or not white were not paid as much as men, but at least they had some sort of options now besides subsistence farming alongside their husband. And at the same time, in the early to mid 1800s, is also when the notion of romantic love and marrying for love became a legitimate thing. Not just whimsical themes and a comforting bedtime story told to princesses before they were hauled off across the continent to marry someone 3 times their age. Marrying for love was actually viable. Now with economic opportunities, women could not only dream of romantic love, but they could actually afford to chase it. Economic liberty gave women romantic liberty. And now some woman could actually be like, yo, dad, I don't want to marry your crusty, dusty ass third cousin. I have a job at the bread factory now. I don't need your ugly cousin's money, okay? Bye. And this leads to an interesting phenomenon. The freedom to choose also implies the freedom to opt out. And a lot of women were opting out of romance altogether. They took the ideals of love seriously, and if they couldn't find someone suitable, they'd just not get married. And this was actually encouraged in some ways. In the late 1800s, there was an editorial published in a prominent American women's magazine, and it was titled, "Honorable Often to be an Old Maid." An old maid is a nicer way of calling someone a spinster, pretty much. Though it's still a little bit, it's not nice. This editorial encouraged ladies who were being picky to just be single if they couldn't find someone they actually liked. And it actually chastised women who wanted to marry the ridicule of being called an old maid, saying, quote, "How dare you then pervert the most sacred institution of the Almighty by becoming the wife of a man for whom you can feel no emotions of love or respect even?" And so the existence of this editorial implies that there was at least some number of women who were choosing to remain single, and who knows why. Maybe these ladies couldn't find anyone they liked or were compatible with, or maybe they did, but they didn't want to sacrifice their freedom. And potentially some of these quote-unquote old maids were lesbians. But to suss out how cats got associated with spinsters or old maids in the first place, let's revisit the spinsters of the High Middle Ages / early modern era. If you remember, in this time period, which is around between 1400 and 1700, give or take, around the colonies of America and throughout Europe, there were some witch hunts happening. Witch hunts in and of themselves are not a phenomenon that were invented in Europe in the mid-second millennia. They've happened since antiquity, probably before. Some of the earliest records of witchcraft are in a Roman law written in 1450 BC, give or take, that outlawed incantations or spells intended to damage cereal crops. And hundreds of supposed witches, most of whom were women, were executed throughout Roman history. For instance, in 370 BC or so, there were almost 200 women who were executed because they were accused of starting a plague. The witch hunts in Rome were nowhere near the scale that we see in the early modern era, but it's interesting to note that it did happen. And actually, for a while in Europe, while witch hunting did happen, it was kind of chill. I mean, women were still being executed for suspected witchcraft, but there were laws on the books specifically against hunting down and executing people for being alleged witches. Like in 643, the Catholic Church issued an ordinance that said, hey guys, don't burn your random serving girls and maids at the stake because you think they're a witch. If you're a good Catholic and you believe in God, you shouldn't believe in witchcraft in the first place, so stop burning your servants. Even as late as 1100, which before reading into this, I would have assumed would have been peak witch burning hour, the King of Hungary banned witch hunting. And his reasoning for banning witch hunting was because witches don't exist. Truly a man ahead of his times. Okay, so this is all like interesting or whatever, but what does this have to do with cats? I mean, obviously today witches are heavily associated with cats, but what about in the Middle Ages? And actually, yes, there is some evidence that cats and witches were associated with each other as early as the Middle Ages, if not even before. In the 1020s, there are some writings by Bouchard, the Bishop of Worms. Okay, apparently this is not like Worms, the bug, but there's a German city called Worms. Anyway, in his writings, Mr. Worm Bishop Guy was talking about how witches didn't exist. I guess witch believers were kind of the 11th century equivalent of flat earthers. Anyway, in his writing, he references a lot of things about witches that are still associated with them today, like brewing potions, flying through the air at night, casting love spells, and significantly turning man into beast, or turning themselves to and from a beast, specifically goats and cats. While it seemed like throughout the early and high Middle Ages, there were quite a few instances of authority figure denouncing people's superstitious beliefs in witches, it started changing in the 1200s. A lot of this anti-witch sentiment is getting kindled around this time because there is a lot of anti-heresy rhetoric going around. We can see this in a decree issued in 1233 by Pope Gregory IX. In this decree, which was called the Vox in Rama, he denounced the heresy of Satan worshippers, and witches were a subset of Satan worshippers. And let's delve into this decree from Pope Greg because he mentions cats. And let's buckle up because this is a wild ride. In the Vox in Rama, Pope Gregory IX describes in vivid detail the initiation rites of Satan-worshipping heretics. First and foremost, a very large toad appears. Then, a tall, pale man appears. Perhaps this is the origin of Waluigi. Anyway, next, the initiate will kiss this tall and maybe Italian man, and this kiss steals the initiate's knowledge of the Catholic faith. Before we continue, imagine how good of a kisser someone has to be for you to just straight up forget about Catholicism. Then, Waluigi takes the initiate to a meal with a bunch of other cultists. And now, here's the cat part. While everyone was eating, at the head of this table was a black cat statue. And then, when everyone is done, the cat, who is presumably Satan himself, comes to life, and everyone eats this cat's butt for dessert. I'm not doing a bit. Pope Gregory IX says in this official decree that every one of these cultists would have to literally kiss the cat's butthole to join the heresy squad. And then after dessert, after kissing the cat's buttholes, wild orgies would break out, which Pope Gregory IX wants everyone to be aware that they are sometimes homosexual in nature. And this is all, let me emphasize, in an official decree made by the Pope. And this decree was sent to sitting kings and emperors and like archbishops and everyone. Like, the Pope literally sent some of the most powerful men in Europe, if not the world, at this time, some mediocre satanic erotica. That would be like today if Joe Biden sent Putin a video of him and Barack making out. Anyway, the takeaway from the Voxim Rama, besides for the cool gay stuff, is that heresy is bad, and so is worshipping Satan. So there should be a crusade against the heretics. And this decree serves as a point of evidence that cats and witches were associated with one another, and also where cats began to be associated with Satan. And this decree also marks a turning point for the persecution of witches, or alleged witches. There are some cases of witch hunting throughout the late Middle Ages, a lot of which were in some way associated with the Inquisitions happening at the time, even though witchcraft was not specifically sought after by inquisitors to punish. It would just be kind of like tacked on after the fact, like felony trespassing for a murder or whatever. One notable witch trial case happened in 1425, and in this, a count of the Holy Roman Empire accused his daughter-in-law of witchcraft. It's thought that this count wanted his daughter-in-law gone because this woman was from a lower stratus of nobility, and therefore she tainted her husband and the whole family by being yucky, low, basically peasant yuck. I don't know how her being a witch would be better, but her being tried as a witch was able to get her killed, and then this guy could get his son remarried to a shiny new lady. But what's important is that this case sort of sets the tone for the rest of the witch trials around Europe that were going to happen throughout the early modern era. While they were, of course, fueled to some extent by religious fervor, they were also, if not more so, fueled by economic motives. Some researchers from the University of Munich investigated witch hunts that happened around Europe in the 16th century. They looked at 3 disparate regions, Bavaria, Essex, and Scotland, all of which differed culturally and, of course, geographically. Nevertheless, the witch trials in these places had one thing in common. They ramped up when the economy slumped. The researchers found that rising grain prices led to an uptick in witch hunting, and this idea is corroborated by modern evidence that we see in sub-Saharan Africa, where witch hunts still happen. When there are economic downturns, witch hunting increases in places like Zimbabwe. But why do economic downturns cause witch hunts? And why were the witches targeted mostly women? Well, think of it this way. If your family was starving, if you were broke and desperate, who would you rather rob? A man who's a well-respected member of his community living with his teenage sons, or an old woman living by herself with no one who cares about her? And not only was this a matter of desperate people doing whatever they could to get by during desperate times, but there was also a sort of brutal capitalistic bent to these witch hunts. Think about it. If you're a candle maker, what's an easy way to snuff out the competition? Just accuse the lady down the street who's selling candles of being a witch. This is a very brief summary of the impact of witch hunts on the economic lives of women. So if you want to learn more about this, I would recommend that you read Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. But when it comes to the small lens we're looking at this issue through of tracing the origin of the crazy cat lady, it's fascinating how we can see the echoes of witch hunts in modern pop culture. You see, the women executed as witches were by and large spinsters. So the stereotypes of witches and all the connotations around them, like being mysterious and owning cats, all of these stereotypes have been tied with the idea of spinsters because, well, witches were by and large literally just spinsters. And we can see these echoes not only in the vilification of old single career-oriented women we see today, but we see these negative satanic ideas still being associated today with cats. Obviously, people aren't setting bags of cat on fire because they think cats are literally symbols of Satan like they did in 16th century France, but negative stereotypes about cats still persist. There was a pet charity that did a survey and found that around half the people they talked to had negative ideas associated with cats or cat owners. And these negative associations tied to cats have real-world consequences. Cats picked up by animal control are far less likely to be returned to their owners than dogs are. And even though there are millions more cats in America than dogs, vets report that they see far fewer cats than dogs. And cats are more likely to be surrendered to animal shelters. And since they're less likely to be adopted than dogs are, cats in shelter are more likely to be euthanized. Stereotypes and seemingly silly cliches on TV aren't harmless, which I know is kind of a no-duh thing to say. While there's examples of this trope being used in an interesting way, like the crazy old cat lady from Kids Next Door who uses her horde of cats to attack people, which is objectively baller, the origins of this trope, while they're interesting, they're dark, and the use of it deserves criticism. I mean, an entire video could be made just unpacking the layers of sexism and ageism and cat phobia or whatever surrounding this trope. I mostly wanted to talk about its historical origins and try to do so in an unbiased way, but I would be remiss to spend 20 minutes talking about it and not also mention that calling someone a crazy cat lady or making a character that is a crazy cat lady is offensive. I'll be clear, I don't like this trope, it just sparked my curiosity, and I'm glad it did, because going down this rabbit hole made it so that I got to learn about the Vox and Rama that an actual pope officially decreed to people about kissing a cat's butthole. So, I think this was a good learning experience for everyone. So, moral of the story, don't set cats or witches on fire. Okay, bye.